Residential developments can be kind of hard to build. Here's 10 that face some major challenges along the way. Number 10, we have the ASCAYA development in Henderson, Nevada. Hong Kong-based billionaire Henry Chang envisioned a Mediterranean-themed desert oasis when he started his ASCAYA project in the early 2000s. The project was to be built in the foothills of the Black Mountain and would offer residents spectacular views of the desert and the Las Vegas skyline in the distance. All homes would be custom built and were required to be at least 4,500 square feet. Preparing the home sites was a massive project as huge amounts of dirt and rock would need to be moved. By the time the site work was complete several years after it started, 15 million cubic yards of earth and rock weighing close to 40 billion pounds had been blasted and excavated. The price tag for site prep alone was an astounding $250 million. Prior to the housing bubble bursting in 2008, the project had only sold 3 lots. When the market collapsed, the project had to be put on hold. Over the next decade, very few lots were sold, but due to the developers' deep pockets, they were able to weather the storm better than some other, more leveraged developments. In recent years, as Las Vegas has seen an influx of new residents, the project has received renewed interest. Celebrities Gene Simmons and Mark Davis made a splash when they purchased lots for new homes in 2021. Despite these headline-generating sales, the project still has a long way to go. As of 2021, of the roughly 300 home sites, only 26 actually had completed homes on them. The momentum has continued in the past couple years, but there's still a long way to go before the site is fully built out. Coming in at number 9, we have Concrete City in central Pennsylvania. Built to house the employees of a Pennsylvania coal mining company, Concrete City was a residential development which consisted of 22 duplexes. It was built in a unique style that at the time was considered very futuristic. Each home had a 100% concrete structure. Although this seemed like cutting-edge technology at the time, many of the families who lived there complained of issues related to the concrete construction, including serious moisture and insulation problems. After only a decade in use, the local codes changed and required the homes to be connected to the sewer grid. Prior to this, each concrete house had its own concrete outhouse. After running the numbers, the coal company determined that the investment required to connect homes to the sewer wasn't worth it. The decision was made to demolish the homes, but because of the concrete construction, this was easier said than done. After dozens of sticks of dynamite did very little to bring down any of the homes, the company decided it would be easier to simply abandon the homes. Over the years, the abandoned concrete shells have turned into a destination for tourists and local graffiti artists. In the late 1980s, it was declared a historical site and has even been used for police, fire, and military training. On to number 8, we have Tundra Village in Texas. Starting in 2006, Tundra Village was a planned residential community near the San Antonio Toyota plant. Original plans called for 78 houses to be built in several phases starting around $450,000 each, and progress was made on 37 of the homes. Most of the homes were complete or nearly complete when the project started facing serious issues. The developer, Muro Padilla, was found to be skimming money for personal uses. Project funds were spent on a mansion, a TV, Padilla's brother's car dealership, and even Padilla's son's wedding. When this was discovered, he was criminally charged and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Another developer tried to salvage the project, but there were so many issues with the existing structures that they were unable to. A master plan for the development was never approved. Utilities, including roads, sewers, electric lines, and water, were never installed, and several of the homes were built in a floodplain. Building permits were not taken out on most of the homes. While the new developers were trying to find a viable solution, the elements and vandals began to take their toll on the home. In the past 2 years, the first street of homes have been renovated, but the remainder of the homes are still derelict and falling apart. Next up, we have the Indian Ridge Resort in Branson, Missouri. The Indian Ridge Resort was an ambitious development project near Table Rock Lake in the Ozarks of southwestern Missouri. It was intended to be a luxurious vacation destination and was started in 2006. Only 2 years later, however, the financial crisis struck and put the project on hold indefinitely. In the years since, the handful of mansions that were built have sat untouched. The elements have taken their toll on the homes, particularly those that were not closed in prior to the construction halt. The result is an eerie sight with incomplete and decaying luxury mansion. In the fallout of the failed project, 5 people actually faced criminal charges and jail time for real estate fraud. Additionally, the developer has faced fines for violating clean water laws. The project recently changed hands, and in 2024, the homes that had been built were finally demolished. At number 6, we have Soul City, North Carolina. During the 1960s, civil rights activist Floyd McKissick laid out plans for an African-American-led planned community in northern North Carolina. While the community would not specifically exclude other races, McKissick dreamed of a place where African Americans held political power, cultural power, and economic power. The area was a 5,000-acre tract of land just south of the Virginia border. In an unlikely alliance, McKissick actually would work closely with the Nixon administration and was able to secure a $14 million loan to get the project started. By the early 1970s, construction had begun and residents began moving in. In addition to residential properties, a healthcare center, daycare center, and business center called Soul Tech One were built. Unfortunately, in the mid-1970s, the momentum began to wane. Due to the remote location of this project, infrastructure proved to be costly to construct, and attracting new residents was a difficult task. In the years since, there have been some new homes constructed, but the area never reached the lofty goal of 50,000 residents by the year 2000 set by McKissick. The Soul Tech One building was purchased by the nearby Warren County Correctional Institution as their facility expanded. Several of the key buildings from the original construction, including the healthcare center, were abandoned. Today, the area is largely unrecognizable from surrounding parts of rural North Carolina, with the exception of the large stone Soul City sign that still stands. Coming in at number 5, we have one of the most recognizable failed residential developments in the world, the Burj Al Babas. Hundreds of nearly identical homes that look like something out of a Disney movie dot the landscape in the rolling hills in an area several hours southeast of Istanbul. This luxury residential development was called the Burj Al Babas and was seen as one that would boost the Turkish economy by creating jobs and bringing in foreign dollars. The project had strong support from many Turkish politicians. While construction was progressing through the mid-2010s, the Turkish economy was struggling. Falling oil prices and geopolitical issues were acting to destabilize the country, which had a strongly negative effect on the currency. Foreign debts became nearly impossible to pay back, causing the developer of the project to go bankrupt in 2018, halting construction progress indefinitely. By this point, 587 of the planned 732 chateau-style homes had been started and were in various states of completion. Several of the homes were sold for around $500,000, but some of these deals were canceled due to the developer's inability to finish. Many of the amenities that were originally promised, including a Turkish bath and sports facilities, had not been built. The developers remain optimistic that they will eventually complete the project. At the asking price, they only need to sell about 100 homes to break even, so the margins are strong if they can ever convince someone to buy a $500,000 McMansion in a country that struggles with economic and political instability. For number 4, we have the Silverado homes in Kingman, Arizona. This was a massive mixed-use development started in 2006 that it stalled in 2008. The development was to include over 10,000 homes when complete, including several hundred high-end desert mansions. To support these communities, there was also plans for 1,000 acres of commercial development, which would include stores, schools, fire stations, and other necessities. When the housing market crashed in 2008, so too did the future of this project. The progress that had begun rapidly came to a halt. The street grids that had been laid out and a handful of high-end model homes were abandoned. In the years since, little has changed on the property. The homes that were built have fallen further into disrepair, mostly due to vandalism. Several years after the housing crash, an extension of the project was officially denied by the county, marking a definitive end to the plan. Coming in at number 3, we have the Rotonda, Meadows, and Villas. As planned community developments became increasingly popular in the 1970s, developers began to try to replicate success stories like Columbia, Maryland, and the Woodlands in Texas. One of these such developments was the Rotonda in Port Charlotte, Florida. The initial portion, which looks like a giant crop circle when viewed from above, was arguably a success, although it did take some time to fill out. Just south and east of this original development was another planned community called the Rotonda, Meadows, and Villas. Road and street signs were installed, lots were divided, and many were actually sold. But in the 50 years since, little has actually changed. Virtually no homes have been built on this massive swath of land. Water, sewer, and electric were not installed across the subdivision, so in the very rare case that someone does want to build a home, they have to pay massive costs to hook up utilities. Over the years, there's been periods where it looks like the project may start back up again, but none of these have really gained much traction. The most recent setback was the housing bubble of 2008. Lots were bought and sold in anticipation of the boom continuing, but when the bubble burst, that kind of went away. On to number 2, we have the compound, across the state on the other side of Florida in Palm Bay. In the early 1980s, General Development Corps began work on a project that would develop a large chunk of Florida's swampland into a dense residential community. Site work began, and by the end of it, 200 miles of road had been paved. Few parcels of land ever sold, however, and by 1991, the development company filed for bankruptcy. This rapid rise and fall of the project made it strikingly similar to several other large-scale Florida development projects. In the years since, the mostly uninhabited area became a haven for motorsports enthusiasts, paragliders, target shooters, and other thrill seekers. This rowdy crowd has contributed to a number of incidents, including several fatal accidents, fires, crimes, and a general sense of lawlessness. Recently, the local police department announced that they're cracking down on those breaking the law in the area known as the compound. Some development has occurred around the fringes, and some of the long-abandoned roads have been repaved. But still, the area is a far cry from what the original developers had in mind. I wasn't kidding when I said that there are several of these Florida developments that were strikingly similar, so this one's so similar to the last two that I decided to make it also number 2. Number 2, Part B, we have Golden Gate Estates. This project would make a large number of lots available at a reasonably affordable price so that middle-class Americans could live out their South Florida retirement dream. The only problem was that the whole thing was at best an incredibly misleading sales pitch and at worst a straight-up scam. After buying tens of thousands of acres of Florida swampland, Gulf American began to lay out basic infrastructure, primary canals, and roads. This was done with little regard for the environment and caused damage that would linger for decades. Billions of gallons of fresh water were drained from the area as the water table dropped dramatically. Besides changing the ecosystem dramatically, it also made the area particularly susceptible to fire. Once the roads had been built and the swamps had been drained, then came the high-pressure sales pitches. Prospective buyers were oftentimes given limited actual information about the sites, but rather sold the dream of a South Florida retirement. They were given free flights to Florida and luxurious meals. Beneath the fancy veneer, however, there was little real substance. The lots didn't have any utilities, although they were promised by Gulf American at one point. Many of the lots were still actually swampland, so locals would joke that the development was being sold by the gallon. Unsurprisingly, the development never turned into the thriving city that Gulf American had pitched, and by the end of the decade, Gulf American was ordered to stop all sales due to fraudulent practices. In one of the most egregious instances of fraud, Gulf American moved the location of sold lots after discovering valuable minerals in the ground underneath of them. In the years since, the area has begun to be reclaimed by nature. There's an ongoing rumor that has been reiterated by local police that abandoned streets deep in the swamps have been used for discreet landing strips for drug trafficking planes sneaking into the United States. Before we get to number 1, I have 2 honorable mention projects that I'm going to throw out there because I don't think they're really big enough to justify a spot on the list, but they're interesting nonetheless. This first one is in Philadelphia's Fishtown neighborhood on the banks of the Delaware River. In 2017, construction began on 18 luxury townhouses. The unique location and waterfront access made the homes particularly sought after when the plans were first announced. Initially, progress was slow due to marshy soil conditions, which made the foundations harder and more expensive to build than had been anticipated. Despite this trouble, progress continued slowly until 2020. By this time, several contractors had been fired off the job, and the developers' financial issues began to mount. Unfortunately, these troubles ultimately led to the developer being forced to declare bankruptcy. The partially completed homes sat idle and began to deteriorate over the next 2 years. Recently, a fire broke out in several of the homes, causing severe damage. At this point, the properties were deemed unsafe and were demolished. The other honorable mention project is the Terra Nativa project in Boise, Idaho. It was a multi-phase residential project. It started in the early 2000s. Phase 1 and 2 were built with no major problems. Things took a turn for the worse with Phase 3, however. Half a dozen homes were built on Alto Via Court, and the excited new homeowners moved in shortly thereafter. The excitement quickly came to an end when the ground started shifting under their feet. The creaking and groaning sounds coming from their house grew louder and louder. Cracks began to appear in the walls, streets, and sidewalks. It soon became clear that they were living on top of a slow-motion landslide. One by one, the houses began to be damaged to the point where they were no longer safe to live in. The residents of Alto Villa Court were forced to move out by order of the city of Boise. The now abandoned homes suffered increasing damage both from the unstable ground that they were built on and from vandals. Recently, several of the homes were demolished. Not surprisingly, this incident kicked off a massive legal battle between the city, homeowners, engineers, developers, and insurance companies. Eventually, a settlement was reached and the residents were relocated elsewhere. Finally, we're down to number 1, and this one was not just a residential development that failed. It was an attempt to build basically a whole city from scratch in the middle of the desert. In the 1950s, Nat Mendelsohn had the dream of building a city in Southern California that would rival Los Angeles. This city, several hours east of LA, was going to be the hottest new place in the state, and it was appropriately named California City. Over the next decade, Mendelsohn began assembling the land and coordinating the building of roads and cul-de-sacs. He felt that the city would be such a desirable place that if he simply gave people access, it would practically grow on its own. The problem was that California City was located in an arid desert far from most employers. California City, which is the 3rd largest by land area in the state and 34th largest city by land area in the country, had no shortage of land or roads, but it did have a massive shortage of people who were willing to move to a largely vacant plot of land, far away from everything that they knew, deep in the middle of the desert. As the project began to flounder, the FTC filed a cease and desist order, arguing that those advertising the project were falsely displaying the merits of a largely non-existent city. This was not before close to 50,000 lots had been sold. In ensuing legal battles, some buyers were refunded a portion of their money. In the years since, the city's grown to a population of 14,000. In the 1990s, concerns were raised about unexploded ordnance and toxic waste in the area due to the area's former use as a military test site. As we move into the future, the city may continue to grow, but it faces major headwinds in the form of toxic waste, unexploded ordnance, and being an abandoned street grid in the middle of the desert with limited amenities or reasons to be there. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you made it through the whole video, I guess hopefully that means that you liked it. So if you do, please like and subscribe. New videos out every Friday.